The wind was already bending fence posts when she stepped off the wagon. It was a grey afternoon, the kind where the prairie sky looked scraped raw, and the frost bit harder than any dog. The man who'd taken her name by contract stood 20 yards from the trailhead, shoulders hunched, face unreadable under his felt hat, hands shoved into a coat that looked too thin for this part of Dakota territory. His name was Raymond Price, and he hadn't said one word on the long ride in from the rail depot. Not welcome, not "I'll carry your trunk," not even her name, Emmeline. She'd come all this way, from Ohio to the edge of the known world, with a black coat that wasn't hers, 2 pairs of wool socks, and a tiny iron stove wrapped in a feed sack. The iron stove had belonged to her grandmother. She'd paid a boy 5 cents to carry it onto the train for her. Raymond hadn't even glanced at it when they loaded it into his wagon. His barn, though, that he'd pointed at. "That there's the barn," he said when they pulled in near dusk. "Cabin's over the rise. You can start your sweeping in the morning." She'd blinked, the cold stinging her eyes worse than dust. "You said I'd have a room." "In the cabin, sure, once we know you ain't crazy." Then he turned and walked away, boots crunching over frost-stiff weeds. Emmeline stood in that barn alone for nearly a full hour after the door shut. The wind whistled through loose boards. The loft was empty except for hay that was going moldy at the edges. She saw no stove, no bed, not even a cot. Just a corner where the floor was half rotted, and the light came in through holes between warped boards. She sat on her trunk and didn't cry. They'd laughed about girls like her back home. Mail-order brides, like some catalog item you picked and paid freight for. The only difference between her and a crate of boots was that she could cook, and maybe sew if her fingers hadn't frozen off by February. She hadn't answered the ad out of some girlish dream. It had been necessity. Her brother died of influenza. Her father drank through his own funeral. Her mother, well, there hadn't been anything left to stay for. But this was worse than she imagined. The next morning, she found Raymond already out by the lean-to, cutting wood. "I'll clean your cabin first," she offered, voice careful. "You'll clean the barn. Cabin's mine." She paused. "Where am I to sleep?" "You're in the barn. I built a little room behind the tack wall for lambing. Door don't shut, but it's got 3 walls and straw. Use that for now. You want to stay come spring? We'll talk." That was it. No more words, just a grunt and the rhythm of an axe striking wood. She did as she was told. But when he walked off to tend cattle that evening, she slid the barn door half closed, pulled her trunk near the lambing stall, and stared at the walls. 3 slats and a roof. No insulation, no stove, no chimney, and outside, the temperature had dropped below 0. That night, wrapped in both skirts, the feed sack, and the coat, she thought of a story her mother once told, about a family in a coal town that survived winter by building a room inside a room, one that trapped breath and heat and body warmth. A cabin inside a cabin. So Emmeline made a choice. The next day, while Raymond was out, she hauled 3 old cattle gates, 2 broken feed bins, and a half-rotted plank of hardwood into the corner of the barn. She scavenged anything that could make a wall, harness straps, spare grain sacks, a broken bench. By day 3, she had a square, barely taller than herself, 10 feet by 7, wedged into the corner of the barn's rear. The inside walls she lined with hay and wool she pulled from the tack rolls. Every crack got stuffed with old canvas and horsehair. The floor she laid with leftover straw, then a layer of gunny sacks, then her quilt. She called it her little cabin. Not aloud, but in her head. It was her one warm thought. Raymond came in once, glared and snorted. "Looks like a rat den." "It's warm," she said. "Warmth is what matters." He didn't answer, but later that night, he left a bundle of kindling by the barn door and didn't say a word about it. By December, the real winter had begun. The Dakota sky stopped pretending to show sun. Snow fell sideways, in sheets, and the wind turned mean. You could hear it scream across the flats like it had teeth. Several families east of them had packed up and gone, or sent the women to town with what wagons they had. But there was no town for her. There was no wagon. Only her little cabin in the barn. The stove, her grandmother's, barely heated a pot of beans. But inside the tiny insulated walls of her box-built den, it made the air survivable. Sometimes she could see frost creeping down the barn walls outside, while her breath stayed invisible inside the little cabin. She burned old feed, broken harness leather, anything. Once, a full wooden yoke Raymond had thrown out. They didn't talk much, but something in his eyes started to shift. One night, mid-January, she found a package by the barn door, strips of cured venison, a bundle of dry twigs, and half a candle stub. He still hadn't said she could move into the main cabin, but neither had he tried to stop her from living. The cold broke records. One morning she awoke to find the animals frozen in the lean-to, a milk pail shattered from the freeze. A man from 10 miles west had been found stiff in his outhouse, jaw locked shut. Raymond started sleeping in the barn some nights, not in her little cabin, but near the animals, buried under sacks. He never asked to join her inside the warm space. but she caught him eyeing the heat coming from the cracks in the makeshift walls. He didn't mock it anymore. Then the barn roof cracked under ice. It was a sound like thunder, the beams groaning, a snap, a fall. Raymond shouted. A horse reared. Snow burst through the broken rafters and blew half across the feed room. Only her little cabin stayed dry, not a flake inside. He came to the door then, no coat, mouth white with cold, and said, almost a whisper, "Is it warm in there?" She opened the flap and nodded. He didn't enter, just stood there a moment, letting the warmth touch his face. Then he walked away again. But the next night, she found his boots outside the entrance, and a note stuck to the plank with a nail. "If it's bad again, I'll knock." The knock came 5 nights later. It wasn't loud, just the sound of knuckles tapping against a half-frozen plank. But in a windstorm like the one howling outside, sleet rattling the tin above, ice snapping off roof edges like teeth, it felt louder than thunder. Emmeline had just fed her grandmother's stove 2 slivers of birch, enough to keep the little box breathing a soft red glow. She'd been holding her feet under the quilt, reading by a stub of candle set in a jar lid. She froze. Another knock. Raymond. She opened the makeshift curtain. His face was pink with cold, covered in frozen mist, lashes thick with frost. He didn't speak. He just nodded at her like a man nods at a river that might be safe enough to cross. She stepped back and lifted the flap. He entered slow, like an animal stepping into a trap, not wanting to make sudden moves. She shifted aside to let him settle near the stove. He didn't sit, just hovered there, hands out. "You built this out of nothing," he muttered. "No one else was going to do it," she said. For the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled. Just a twitch, just enough to show he wasn't made of stone. That first night they shared the space in silence. She laid out a folded quilt, and he lay down without a word, curled on his side, back to her, like it was the only decent thing he could think to do. Come morning, the storm hadn't eased. The barn groaned under the weight of crusted snow, but her cabin within a barn held. No wind got through, no frost formed inside. The temperature stayed warm enough for breath to vanish before their eyes. That afternoon, Raymond left and returned with a pail of clean snow to melt, 2 apples, and a small paper-wrapped parcel. Inside were matches, 40 of them. "I traded the Trapper West for 'em. Figured we'll need more than we have if this keeps on." Emmeline didn't say anything, but she took the parcel gently, like it was glass. They used one to light the next fire. The rest stayed tucked in a jar under her bunk. By mid-February, the prairie had become a graveyard of stories. A family froze 2 counties east, 4 children and a father. The mother found days later burned up from fever and frostbite in a neighbor's lean-to. In town, a general store owner was found inside a whiskey barrel trying to escape the cold. He hadn't made it. The weather reports were just numbers scratched in charcoal on the back of post notices. -38 degrees tonight. Or wind to gut a horse. Raymond's voice grew softer in those days. He didn't say much. But when he did, it was less sharp. She learned he had a sister back in Ohio, one who never answered his letters, that he once tried to build a cabin on the north side of a draw, but it flooded out in spring, that he'd meant to build a second stove for the barn, but ran out of time, that the man who delivered the mail once froze in the middle of his route. They found him 6 feet from a neighbor's porch. He said it like facts, no emotion, but she saw the strain in his jaw when he recounted it, how he stared past the boards like the memory had weight. She began to understand. This land took more than it gave. It didn't care what you'd planned. The second break in the barn roof happened one night when the snow turned heavy as wet stone. A beam gave way near the tack wall, collapsing with a crash that sent mice skittering and horses braying. Raymond bolted upright. Emmeline already had her boots on. They moved together, without speaking, dragging hay bales and feed bags to protect the animals. He climbed the rafters in the dark, braced a board against the break, and when the whole wall shuddered, he shouted once, loud enough to startle her. "Rope!" She threw it without hesitation. That night they worked until their hands bled, fingers numb, but they saved the barn. When they finally returned to the little cabin, soaked and shivering, she lit the stove while he peeled off frozen gloves. He didn't speak. She held out her hands to him. He looked at her, not with desire, with something older, quieter, gratitude. He took her hands and pressed them between his. His palms were cracked, fingers bruised, but they held hers like he meant it. By the final week of February, their breath stopped showing inside the cabin. The little stove, fed constantly, made the air tolerable. Still, they rationed everything. Firewood was nearly gone. Feed was low. She counted 6 matches left in the jar. Raymond stopped sleeping out with the animals. He didn't even pretend anymore. The barn was death. Her little room was survival. One night, she woke to find him seated upright, watching the door. "What is it?" she whispered. "I thought I heard something," he said. "Coyotes?" No. Wind sounded like a woman crying. They sat up, both listening, but there was only the rattle of the barn walls, ice ticking across the boards. He finally said, I dream about my mother in storms like this. She used to sing when I was small, something about sunshine and jars of cherries. You miss her? Emmeline asked. Every time I close my eyes. She hesitated, then said, my mother used to hum while sewing. One winter she sewed 3 quilts from flour sacks and stitched Bible verses into each one. Raymond looked over. Do you still have them? One. It's under you. He smiled at that. Maybe that's why I sleep warm. They started reading aloud to each other. Her father's Bible, mostly. Then an old pamphlet she'd carried, full of stories about famous women of the frontier. She read the one about the girl who fought off wolves with a kettle. Another about a woman who kept a family of 10 alive by digging tunnels through snow. Raymond listened like it was the last music on earth. You belong in that book, he told her once. She shook her head. I'm not brave. You are. You built a home inside a home. Who else would think to do that? She didn't answer, but the words stayed in her chest, warming something deep. March came, but the thaw didn't. The ground stayed hard. The snow didn't melt. It just turned to crust. Mail stopped. The wind, when it came in bursts like fists. One morning, Emmeline woke coughing, smoke thick inside their room. The stovepipe was clogged. Backdraft. She kicked Raymond awake. Together they pushed the stove open, beat the embers flat, and dragged the whole thing outside into the barn, snow freezing it instantly. The wall where it had vented was scorched. Raymond inspected it, jaw clenched. We need to rebuild the pipe. I don't know how. I do, but I'll need your help. They worked for 6 hours that day. Ripped the pipe from the barn's main chimney stack, one she hadn't even known existed, and rerouted it to the cabin's side. He showed her how to lash tin with baling wire, how to insulate a seam with mud and crushed flax. That night, they sat beside a fire burning clean. She'd never known warmth could feel like pride. She started keeping a list inside her mind of the things she never thought she'd do. Rebuild a stovepipe, sleep under 3 layers of rope and burlap, keep one man alive by building a box of air inside a barn of ice. Raymond one night traced a line along the makeshift wall with his hand. Come spring, he said, I'll build you a cabin of your own, one with real walls, a proper stove, glass windows. She didn't say anything, but he added, you could still leave, you know, take the train back east. I know, she said. And if you stay? If I stay, she interrupted softly, I'd want the cabin inside the barn to stay too. As a reminder, he nodded. Fair enough. They didn't kiss, not then, but she moved a little closer. Spring didn't arrive. March bled into April with hardly a thaw. The wind changed directions, the snow crusted over, and even the ravens flew lower to the ground. At night, the frost etched itself like spiderwebs into the barn's wooden beams. It was a long, patient starvation, not of food, but of light, of warmth, of hope. Some mornings Emmeline had to blink twice just to believe the sun was real, but the little cabin within the barn held, and inside it, she and Raymond began to move like 2 sides of the same coin. Not lovers, not quite yet, but no longer strangers. They shared breath and blankets, sweat and labor, silence and small victories. By now, they were rationing not just matches, but words. Still, some things didn't need to be said. He began sleeping with one boot on. She didn't ask why, but noticed how he rose twice a night to check the barn door, then sat listening for long stretches, staring at the grain sacks stacked near the animals. He wouldn't say what he was worried about, but when she pressed him one morning, he looked at her with something between apology and fear. There's talk of drifters, he said. Men without land, without food. She nodded. You think they'll come? He rubbed his jaw. They already did. Last year, one tried to break into a rancher's cabin 6 miles north. Got shot. She waited. Then they burned the place down. Emmeline didn't flinch. If someone comes, we won't burn. Oh, my cabin's built better than that. He half smiled. Yes, it is. She started reinforcing the walls, quietly, methodically, took boards from the broken parts of the barn, pulled nails from abandoned fence posts, and fashioned a second interior layer, staggered like bricks. Raymond didn't question it. He helped. By April's end, her little useless box, the one settlers had once laughed at, the one that had been a lambing stool, now had 2 layers of wood, a buried stone hearth lined with packed earth, and a hanging sheet of burlap that could be dropped like a curtain in case of emergency. The snow still fell in bursts, but each time it did, the little cabin grew more impenetrable. One night, just as she was spooning mush into a kettle for supper, the barn door creaked. Raymond had just gone out to check the frozen well. Emmeline assumed it was him, but it wasn't. A figure stepped inside, then another. 2 men, coats like stitched shadows. One carried a crowbar, the other had a limp. They didn't speak, just stared around the barn like they owned it. Then the one with the limp sniffed the air. "Smells warm," he said. Emmeline froze. Her hands were near the kettle. A knife lay behind her on a crate, just out of reach. Her eyes flicked once toward it, then back. The crowbar man stepped forward. "Anyone here?" She didn't answer, but then came footsteps behind them. Heavy, hurried. Raymond. He didn't speak either, just walked up beside the men with a slow, measured gait. He was carrying the rusted double barrel he kept above the tack wall, the one that barely worked, but it didn't have to fire to make a point. The crowbar man turned. Raymond didn't raise the gun, just held it at his hip. "Don't want trouble," the limper muttered. Raymond said nothing. They backed out, slowly. The barn door creaked shut again. Afterward, Emmeline couldn't stop shaking, but Raymond sat beside her, fed the stove, and laid a hand on her back. His palm was firm, steady, like a rock on a windy hill. "They'll be back," he whispered. "We'll be ready." From that night on, they slept in shifts. One watched, one rested. The cabin wasn't just warm now. It was fortified. He nailed a latch into the door. She packed snow into the cracks between logs outside to keep it sealed even tighter. Raymond buried a hatchet in the straw near the entrance. Emmeline kept the iron poker beside the bed. "I came here to be a wife," she said once, voice low. He looked over. "And now?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Now I'm a carpenter, a soldier, a chimney sweep, a welder." He laughed for the first time since she'd known him. "Marry me in the spring," he said, so quietly she almost thought she'd imagined it. She didn't answer that night, but the next morning she laid his coffee tin beside the stove, full, hot, with the last of her sugar stirred in. The barn roof held through the last snowfall. The drifters never returned. Raymond set 2 traps outside, which stayed empty, but Emmeline noticed how much more carefully he moved afterward, how he never left the barn without checking the horizon. One dawn in late April, a sound split the cold like an axe through ice. A bird, a single bird call. Emmeline opened her eyes and felt something different in the air. Not warmth exactly, but softness. The snow wasn't falling. The wind was gone. And when she cracked the flap of their little door and stepped out into the barn, her breath hung heavy but unmoving. Stillness. Outside, through a knothole in the barn's far wall, a line of sky glowed the faintest pink. She stepped back inside, knelt near Raymond and whispered, "I think it's over." He opened his eyes slowly. "The storm?" She nodded. They didn't speak more than that, but after breakfast, they opened the big barn doors wide for the first time in months. The world was still frozen, but not hopeless. The snowdrifts shimmered instead of smothered. The trees were bare, but not broken. Even the wind seemed to be resting. They stood there together, in the wide-open mouth of the barn, like 2 people who had walked through a graveyard and found themselves breathing on the other side. That evening, Raymond brought in 2 wooden beams and set them near the stove. "What are those for?" she asked. "For the cabin, the one I promised." She didn't answer right away, then said, "Don't rush it." "I'm not." She laid a hand on the wood. It was warm from the sun, just barely. In May, the ground finally softened. Raymond plowed it in a straight line, then again and again. He let her try the second day, holding the plow handles while the mule pulled slow. Her hands blistered, her shoulders ached, but she didn't stop. At night she sat with her hands in his. Blistered palms, calloused fingers. "You belong here," he said softly. "I think I do," she whispered. The townsfolk came back slowly. Wagons creaked over thawed mud. Mail started again. Word spread of who'd stayed and who hadn't, of who'd made it and who the winter had taken. Raymond didn't say much about the others, but when a neighbor rode up one morning to see if they were still alive, he led him straight to the barn. "This is where we lived," he said, gesturing at the little structure still standing in the corner. The man, a settler from 2 ridges west, laughed when he saw it. "Hell of a doghouse," he said. Raymond didn't laugh. He just looked at Emmeline. "She built it. Saved our lives." That shut the man up. He nodded once, respectful, and left. Emmeline watched the man go, then turned back toward the barn. "You know what they'll say," she muttered. Raymond raised an eyebrow. "What? That it was useless? That we built a shed inside a shed? That it was silly?" He shrugged. "Then let them freeze next time," she smiled. "I hope there's no next time." That summer they built the new cabin together. It was just 30 feet from the barn, but Emmeline insisted the barn stay standing, and the little room inside it too. She swept it every week, recorked the boards, lit the stove now and then just to keep it breathing. When neighbors came by to borrow tools or seeds, she'd sometimes show them the room. They always shook their heads. "Can't believe you 2 made it through in that." She'd smile politely, but later alone, she'd sit inside the tiny cabin again, close her eyes, remember the sound of sleet against the beams, Raymond's steady breath beside her, the iron stove pulsing red. She didn't regret any of it. One night in July, Raymond brought her a ring, not store-bought, forged from a horseshoe, the same one they'd pulled off the mare that died in January. He knelt in the barn. "Not much of a chapel," he said. "It's perfect," she whispered. They married the next day, just them, the preacher from town and the barn. The little cabin stood behind them, silent, warm. By August, grass had returned to the plains, stretching out like a worn quilt that had finally been shaken free of its frost. The creek behind the ridge babbled again, and bees stitched lazy circles through the air above their corn rows. The wind no longer screamed, it whispered. But Emmeline didn't forget what the wind had once sounded like. Neither did Raymond. Their new cabin stood strong by then. 2 rooms, a root cellar, a proper stone chimney, and a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and smoke. It had glass in the windows. Real glass Raymond had traded for with a German settler passing through. And for the first time in her life, Emmeline had a place that truly belonged to her. Still, when the nights dipped cool, even just a touch, she found herself standing in the barn again, standing before the tiny cabin she'd built in desperation. She'd step inside, touch the stove's iron lip, and sit quietly on the old quilt they'd never removed. She never lit the fire, but the memory of heat was still in the walls. The town started talking again in September. First, it was just curiosity. "Is that the woman who lived through the freeze in a barn?" Then came the skepticism. "He must have let her into the house early, right?" And eventually the mocking. "She built a room inside a barn? Why not build a second outhouse while she was at it?" Raymond ignored it. Emmeline didn't. She heard it in the dry goods store, at the feed co-op, even from the preacher's wife, whispered behind a cupped palm. "Poor dear, bless her heart. Can't blame her for going mad, not after that storm." So she stopped going into town. But one afternoon, she found a boy standing at the edge of their property. Young, maybe 12, hair like straw, cheeks red from sunburn. He held something wrapped in a wool kerchief. "What's that?" she asked, stepping toward him. "It's a gift," he said, shy. "Pa says you built a stoveroom inside your barn, and it saved you." I told him maybe we could do that too. He said I should come ask you how. She blinked. "That's very kind." He handed over the kerchief. Inside it, a bundle of dried apples. "For teaching me something," he mumbled, then turned and ran. She stood there, stunned. Later that night, she told Raymond. He nodded slowly. "There it is. Someone noticed the right way." She started writing things down. At first it was just a list. How to make a windbreak with straw, how to stuff cracks with canvas and flax, how to reroute a stovepipe using only salvaged tin, how to layer hay and sackcloth to hold body heat. But then the list turned into a set of instructions, diagrams, notes in the margins. Raymond came home one evening to find her drawing on the back of a shipping crate lid. "What's that?" he asked. "Plans," she said. "For what?" "For a booklet. I was thinking if another storm like that one ever hits, people might want to know how to build what we did. Not just for us, for families with babies, old folks, anyone without a proper house." He set down his sack of corn, sat beside her. "You're writing a guide," she smiled. "I guess I am." The first frost came early that year, October 3rd. Not enough to kill the crops, but enough to wake the fear again. By then, Emmeline had 4 pages written in ink and another 6 in pencil. Raymond helped her stitch them into a cover made from muslin and birch bark. She titled it plainly, "How to Build Warmth from Nothing." They made 7 copies, traded one to the general store in exchange for sugar, left another with the traveling preacher. Raymond mailed 2 others out to far-off counties, one to his sister, another to a farming collective near Sioux Falls. They kept one in the barn. One woman came in person, a widow from the next county west, said she'd heard about the bride who built the box and wanted to learn. Emmeline showed her the barn, the cabin inside it, the layered walls, the hearthstone trick. The woman cried. "I buried my son last January," she said, running her hand along the beams. "He froze before morning. If I'd had something like this..." Emmeline didn't say anything, just hugged her. That fall, snow came light. The storms passed wide of the prairie. But each time the wind howled at night, Emmeline and Raymond sat by their new stove, held hands and let silence wrap around them like a quilt. They didn't speak of the cold anymore, but it never left them. One night, Raymond traced the scars on his fingers from where the rope had frozen and cut deep during the barn collapse. "You ever wish you'd answered a different ad?" he asked. She looked at him long. "No," she said, then added, "You ever wish you'd married someone else?" He laughed. "I didn't marry you because I had to. I married you because you made a room warm enough to hold a man like me." December arrived gentle. Light dustings, no drifts, but the barn still creaked like it remembered. Emmeline kept the little room clean, not for sleeping, not anymore, but as a place to teach. The widow came back, this time with her cousin, then 2 neighbors, then a boy and his grandfather. Emmeline didn't ask names, just showed them how to line a wall with wool, how to brace a stove on a bed of clay, how to build a ceiling low enough to trap heat without choking the air. One boy asked, "Why not just live in a real house?" She answered, "Because not everyone has one, but everyone has something, and warmth doesn't care where it comes from." That boy's name was Luke. A month later, she got a letter from his father. Said the storm had hit worse near their county line. Power went out, cabin chimney cracked, but Luke built a tiny room inside their shed, saved his sister, saved their newborn calf, maybe saved all of them. "We call it a bride room now," the letter ended. "Named after you." Raymond read the letter aloud by firelight. Emmeline didn't say anything for a long while. Then she stood, walked to the barn, and sat in her old place. He followed, leaned in the doorway. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" She looked around. The rafters, the stove, the faded patch of wool still tucked into the corner. "I used to think this was where I'd die," she whispered. "Now I think it's where I became someone else." Raymond came and sat beside her, took her hand. Neither of them spoke again that night, but the silence wasn't cold. Winter returned the following year like a shadow over memory, slower, gentler, but no less real. By then, Emmeline's name had begun to travel, quietly, on whispers through the prairie. Folks didn't use it the way you'd name a teacher or a preacher. They said it the way a person says the name of a thing that once saved them. Not everyone had read her little booklet, but more than one family had copied the method. There were straw-lined stalls behind ox sheds now, makeshift chimneys with bent tin and clay, boxed-in corners layered in canvas and love. She never claimed credit for any of it. She only taught when asked. The barn still stood, the room inside it remained untouched, and the frost returned. Tapping, not tearing, whispering, not howling. By then, Raymond's cough had worsened. It started with a rasp in early November, then turned to wheezing. He kept working, feeding the stock, mending fence posts, breaking ice in the troughs. But Emmeline saw it, the way he held his side when he thought she wasn't looking, the way he sat longer at the edge of the bed before rising. They saw a doctor in town. The man shook his head. "Lungs," he said, "likely from that storm, or all the smoke from that old pipe he rebuilt." Emmeline sat quiet in the wagon the whole way home. When they reached the barn, she led Raymond not to the house, but to the little room they had once shared. "You'll rest here tonight," she told him. He looked confused. "But we've the house now, the good stove." She nodded. "Yes, but this room doesn't just hold heat, it holds us." For weeks, she nursed him there. Not because the house wasn't good enough, but because he slept better in the little room. He said the walls remembered, that they breathed warmth back into his bones. Neighbors sent soups. A schoolteacher from town sent a letter of thanks. A widow wrote that her copy of How to Build Warmth from Nothing had now passed through 11 families. And one morning, a rider from the capital brought news. Someone had submitted Emmeline's booklet to a state office. The Agricultural Society wanted to print it, not just 7 copies, hundreds. They offered her nothing more than postage and the dignity of her name on the back, but she accepted. "I didn't write it for money," she told Raymond. He smiled from his bed of wool and quilts. "You wrote it to stop people from dying." Raymond passed quietly in February. No snowstorm, no wind, just a cough, a long breath, and then stillness. She held his hand through the night. In the morning, she lit the little stove one last time. She sat beside him and waited for the sun to touch the cracks in the wall. Then she opened the door, let the warmth rise, let the light in. She buried him behind the barn, beneath a crooked cottonwood, just the 2 of them and the preacher. She built the marker herself, stones from the creek, smoothed by time. That spring she hosted a gathering. Women from town, men from 3 counties, children, widows, orphans, homesteaders. Over 50 folks stood in the barn, circled around the little room like it was a cathedral. She read from the booklet. She showed the diagrams. She passed around the match jar. And then she said the only thing that mattered. This wasn't just about heat. It was about knowing you have something to offer, even when the world says you don't. "I came here as a bride no one wanted, and I built something everyone needs." Years passed. The house aged. The barn sagged. But the little room remained untouched. When schoolteachers came, she showed them. When children came, she taught them. When storms came, she trusted it. And when she finally grew old, when her hair turned white and her hands ached from the cold, they still called it the bride's room. Some said it was silly, some said it was small, but every winter it stood. And in the coldest season the prairie had ever known, when fires failed and roofs collapsed and pipes froze, families remembered her name. Not because she was rich, not because she was brilliant, but because she had once, in the middle of death, built warmth from nothing.